do want to say that we are amazed at the way the Lord works. We're thankful for His providence throughout our lives, and I often think back upon this church and when it was organized, and the many battles that the church has fought and struggles that the church has gone through. And though I believe that every one of the Lord's churches is a miracle, I really see that here. This church is a work of God. It is a miracle. I mean, those that have been here from its beginning, it's miraculous that the church is even here. It really is. It's a testimony of God's grace, a testimony of the goodness of the Lord, and some that are here have fought those battles and they've been faithful, and God has blessed in a mighty way. And we do want you to know that we are here to minister. That's what a pastor is for. Here to minister to your needs, whatever those might be, and for you to feel free to call, to feel that we can be approached and talked to. The Lord's given me 2 ears and 1 mouth. That means I'm to listen twice as much as I talk, and vice versa. But we just want you to know that we're here for the Lord's honor, for His glory. We want to serve the Lord together in these last days. And again, we're here for you, and you can come to us. We'd like today to turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 21. Exodus 21. We know that God, in chapter 20, stated the foundation of all law, and that being the 10 Commandments. In chapters 21 through 23 of the book of Exodus, Moses basically tells us how to apply these laws, the 10 Commandments, to specific situations. Chapter 21 opens, verse 1, "Now these are the judgments, or the regulations, or statutes of God." That statement applies to everything that's said here in chapters 21 through chapter 23. So it's God's regulations. God gave these regulations to Moses to govern the people so that they would be blessed in the land that He had promised to bring them into. Now, if you read through chapters 21 through 23, you find statutes, you find regulations concerning slaves, concerning capital offenses, physical injuries, thieves, property damage, something said about safe deposits and borrowing, and sexual seduction, idolatrous customs, and care of the needy, legal justice, and the Sabbaths, annual festivals. All of these things are covered in chapters 21 through 23. What it reveals is that God's authority, God's government, God's claim in all areas of our life, in all circumstances of life. What it reveals is that God is to be in every area of our life. Every area. Life is to be all about God. We want to read today verses 1 through verse 6. Now, these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she hath borne him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. So what we have here, we have a regulation, God regulation, concerning the issue of Hebrew slavery. In the law, there are many, many regulations given to control slavery, to confine it, to restrict it within very narrow bounds. So we have here is one of the many regulations concerning slavery. Now there are several ways that a person could become a slave. For example, a person could become a slave to pay off debts. He would serve for a certain period of time to pay off his debts, and then after his debts were paid, that servant would go free without any obligation for his debts. Poor people could seek refuge by becoming a servant, in exchange for which they would receive food and clothing and housing. Thieves could make restitution by a period of service. But here in our text, we see that whatever the reason for the slavery, it was limited by law to a maximum of 6 years. Whatever the reason was, didn't matter. It was limited to a maximum of 6 years. And then, in the 7th year, the slave was permitted to go free. But there was an exception to this law. What if the slave did not want to leave his master? He did not want to leave his master's house. In that case, the slave could decide to become a permanent slave. And he was to openly, publicly declare himself a slave to this master. Verse 5, and if the servant shall plainly say, skip some words, I will not go out free. This servant, he wants to stay. So he has to make a public declaration. He has to do so in a very plain way. State his intent. This is my master, and I'm going to serve him for the rest of my life. Now, in this message, we want to look at this exception and make application to you and I as willing servants of the Lord. Our subject is an open proclamation with regard to the rest of our life. None of us know how much time we have left. We have no idea. But that's really not the issue. The issue is, what are we going to do with the rest of our life. However long or short that might be. So let's consider briefly this servant in our text, and then we'll get into some specifics. But in our text, the servant has served his master for 6 years. By law now he can leave the place of his servitude, and he could live the rest of his life as he pleased, or he could choose to stay and serve his master for the rest of his life. But at the end of 6 years, we read in verse 3 that if he became a servant by himself, then he shall go out by himself. And if he had a wife, and if he and his wife had become servants together, then he and his wife would go out. And then we read in verse 4, let's say he became a servant by himself, but during his period of servitude he was married and he had children. In that case, he would go out by himself. The wife and the children would become his masters. But regardless of how he came in, regardless of what the reason was for becoming a servant, at the end of 6 years, he was faced with a life choice. It was now time. He is now brought to a place in his life where he must state his intent. I believe that we are at that place. I believe it is time for all of God's people to state their intent. We're not going to serve God, or we're going to serve God. But it's time for everyone to be honest and state their heart's intent. So at the end of 6 years, he's brought to this place where he must state his intent. He could go and live his life as he pleased, or he could stay with his master and live under the government of his master for the rest of his life. There was nothing in between. He could not do both. He had to do one or the other. He had to stay or he had to leave. He could not bounce back and forth. Oh, we have a lot of that today. But it's time where people have to say, I'm either going to serve God or I'm not. No bouncing back and forth. It's either stay or leave. Depending, again, he can't just bounce back and forth depending on his circumstances. Circumstances have nothing to do with this. Depending upon his feelings. Well, I don't feel like it today. It doesn't matter. This has nothing to do with circumstances. It has nothing to do with feelings. It basically comes to this. I am going to live the rest of my life for myself, or I'm going to live the rest of my life for my master. That's what it comes down to. Which are we going to do? Because we cannot do both. We cannot serve two masters. It's one or the other. This was something that the servant, of course, no one could decide this for him. This was something that the servant had to settle in his own heart and mind. Am I going to live the rest of my life for myself, do what I please, or am I going to put the rest of my life under the government of God? Which is, or the government of my master? Which is it going to be? Either I will resolve to leave, live my life separate and apart from the master, or I will resolve to stay and live the rest of my life subject to the authority and connected to my master. That was the position that this servant was brought to after 6 years. And he must state his intent. Had to. It was the law. There was no room for half-heartedness. There was no room for indecision. There was no room for indifference. After 6 years, it is time. And I believe it's time. After 6 years, it is time. Either it will be life with the Master, or it will be life apart from the Master. But it had to be one or the other. It could not be both. So after 6 years, the servant is brought to the place where he must declare one or the other. My master or my life. It's one or the other. My master or me. My master or life apart from my master. But it was now time where he had to make his intent known. It was time that he must declare. He must declare openly his intent. Master or me. It was time for him to declare what mattered to him the most. It's time. It's time. It's time for God's people to declare what matters to them the most. Your own life or what the Master wants. So after 6 years, the servant is brought to the place where he must declare what will identify the rest of his life. Again, none of us know how much time we have left, and that's not the issue. But we must declare, what is it that's going to identify the rest of my life? Is it work or is it the Lord? Is it family or is it the Lord? Is it recreation or is it the Lord? Is it me or is it the Lord? But the time has come when God's people must declare. Which will it be? What is going to identify the rest of my life? So he's brought to this point in his life where he now must declare his life occupation. After 6 years, it is time for the servant to declare what his life will be. After 6 years, if this servant wanted to stay with his master, he was to make that known to his master. And we see that in verse 5. He was to do so plainly, in a very obvious way. This law was put into effect so the master could not force him to stay. He had to state plainly, Master, I want to stay with you the rest of my life. And he had to say so in a very plain way. When he made that known to his master, then the master was then to bring the servant before the judges. And as the master and servant walked together to face the judge, you look at that servant. He's not sad. He's not despondent. He's not down in the dumps. You look at him. He's happy. He's content. He's filled with conviction and assurance. This is what I want. I want to live with this man. When they arrived before the judges, the servant to the judges, because the judges have to determine that this man is not being coerced by his master. This man is not being forced by his master against his will. The servant had to make it clear and give explicit testimony before the judges. I want to serve my master. for the rest of my life. And though I can go out free, I will not go. I will not go out free. But I want to continue to serve this man, my master. And he was to be very forthright. He was to be very open. He was to be straightforward in his declaration. There was to be no vagueness. He was to declare without hesitation, without any sense of reluctance, I want to live the rest of my life under the authority of my master. And as he spoke, he was not to do so with timidness or misgivings. He was to boldly declare his intention. Again, it's to safeguard against this man being made a slave against his own will. So he was to state his intent in such a way that there was no mistaking, there was no confusion, there was no uncertainty concerning his life intention. Once this was done, there was a ceremony to make it official. As a public declaration and the sign of the servant's commitments to his master and to his master's house, that servant, in the presence of the judges, was brought to the doorpost, and the master would take a nail and he would drive it through the lobe of the servant's ear and into the doorpost. That servant was now marked for his master in a very noticeable and pronounced way. You go back to your baptism. That's what you did. You made open declaration of salvation, and you made open declaration that it was your intent to serve the Lord. Now, many have gone back on that declaration, and they need to make it right. But that slave was now marked for his master. And he was marked in a very obvious way, a very recognizable way for his master. So after 6 years, it was time. And it is time. It is time. It is time for every child of God to publicly, to openly, to very plainly declare his or her intent with regard to the Lord. It's time. It's time. If you say, well, I'm not sure I want to serve the Lord for the rest of my life, then get out of the way. That's right. Get out of the way. But it's time. It's time. It's time for those who have been bought by God, sought by God, reached by God, rescued, raised, and lifted from a spiritual grave, delivered and set free and made a child of God, made an heir of God and a joint heir with Christ, made rich beyond measure, and we have peace with God. We are accepted by God. We have been made citizens of heaven, and we have a place reserved in heaven, and we are kept by God. It is time for God's people, in a very marked way, in a very noticeable way, I am going to live the rest of my life for Him. I place my life under His rule, under His authority. Life is no longer about me. I want to live for Him. It's time for all of God's people. Well, you don't understand. You have to say it in a very open way. I don't know how many days I have left, but whatever days they are, they will be spent with the Master, with my God. So let's look at the proclamation of this servant. There's several things that we want to notice that are applicable to you and I. The servant was to plainly declare that he has been blessed by his master. In verse 5, he says, I will not go out free. I won't do that. He is declaring, my master is worthy. My master has been good to me these 6 years. Most of us have more than 6 years since we've been saved, and we say, the master has been so good to me. My master is worthy of life service. For you and I that are saved, the master has been so good to us. He brought us from death unto life. He came to where we were in the prison house of sin. He broke asunder the chains that held us. He brought us out of the darkness into light. He lifted us from the broad road that leads to destruction. He has saved us from eternal ruin. He forgave us our sins. He blotted them all out, put them away, removed them, washed us from the filth, reconciled us to Himself, made us acceptable to God, taken us to be His sons and His daughters, making us joint heirs with Christ, making us citizens of heaven. He's been an unfailing intercessor on our behalf. He's worked all things out for our good. He has lavished us abundantly with undeserved goodness. He has every single step of the way been our sufficiency and our strength and our help. And it's time for God's people to say, God has been so good to me. I would not think of it to be any other way. I want to live for Him for the rest of my life. Because He's been so good to me. How can you not declare that? The height of selfishness. Well, I've got this to do and I want to do this and this. You're selfish. You're ungrateful. It should be, I just want to live the rest of my life for the Master. Secondly, the servant plainly declared his desire toward his Master. After 6 years, the servant is brought to the place in his life. It's time for him to proclaim his desire for the rest of his life. Again, he could leave. He could stay. But after 6 years, he's brought to the place where without coercion, he is to state his aspiration, state his determination concerning the rest of his life. He could go back to his former life, or he could forever remain with the Master for the rest of his life. But the servant in our text is saying, I will not go out free. I can. By law I can go, but I will not. When he said, I will not go out free, what he's saying is, this is my Master. Look at the Lord Jesus Christ and say, this is my Master. I want to live the rest of my life for Him. I want to live the rest of my life with Him. He was saying, this is my Master. I want to serve Him. I want to work for Him. I want to do His bidding for the rest of my life. He was saying, this is my master. I prefer and esteem him above all others and all else, even above my own freedom. This is my master. You know, people say, it's my life. Well, you're wrong right there. It's not. But it's my life. I can do what I want. Well, let's say that was even so. You could do whatever you want. You shouldn't want to. You should want to live for him. He was saying, this is my master. I refuse all other masters. I refuse to go my own way. I refuse to go back to my old life. This is my master. So there he stands before the judges. And he explicitly declares, this is my master. And I have voluntarily chosen to remain with him for the rest of my life. That's what the servant is saying when he says, I will not go out free. He was saying, this is my master. And it is my desire for the rest of my life to be surrendered to his government, to be under his rule, to be under his ways, and to serve his interests for the rest of my life. He's been good to me. He's my master. He was saying, this is my master, and I, for the rest of my life, desire to put forth all my effort and give my best to him, rather than put forth that effort toward my own life. This is my master. So you see, to serve his master for the rest of his life was his resolve. It was his purpose. It was his intent. It was his object. It was his aim. It was his passion. It was his plan. Plan to serve God. Most people plan not to serve God. Plan to serve God. Make that your life's plan. I'm going to serve God. That's my plan. Nothing's going to interfere with that plan. This man was now planning to live the rest of his life with his master. We, the saved by grace, need to stand without any hesitation, without any bashfulness, without any timidness, and let it be publicly known at all times and under all circumstances and in all situations. We don't want there to be no misunderstanding, no misinterpreting, no confusion, no uncertainty. It is our desire to be under the government of God. It's time. It's my desire to be under the government of God, regardless of circumstances. That needs to be our intent. To be surrendered to the rule of God. To exist, to serve his interests. To exist to please him in all things. To obey him in all things. To honor and glorify him in all things. It is our intent to serve the Lord with our lives for the rest of our lives. That's what this servant was declaring. He was declaring his desire toward his master. You'll notice also, thirdly, the servant plainly declared his love for his master. In verse 5, he was to plainly say, I love my master. I love my master. His desire to stay, his desire to serve for the rest of his life, that desire was constrained by love for his master. It was as if he said, I love my master too much to leave him. I love my master too much to leave him. I love my master too much to stop serving him. You see, in that 6-year period, that servant began to feel love for his master. And service became different. I love my master too much for him not to be my life. This servant is saying, I can't even bear the thought of leaving my master. I love my master. It was a love that caused him to have a deep interest in his master's affairs. It was a love that drew him to his master. Do you have that kind of love? A love that makes you interested in the master's affairs. A love that draws you to the master. It was a love that filled him with passion and yearning for his master. It was a love that was uninhibited. It was a love that made the master the priority of his life. His master was his priority. We, the saved by grace, our lives ought to proclaim openly, very explicitly, without any vagueness whatsoever, without any confusion, without any uncertainty. The Lord is the love of my life, and I will serve Him. Our lives ought to be a plain and clear declaration that we are enthralled and captivated by the Lord, and that He is everything to us. You don't let family get in the way. You don't let jobs get in the way. You don't let anything get in the way. Amen. Because I love my master. The servant in our text was saying, they're standing side by side when they present themselves to the judges. And this is my master. And I voluntarily choose to remain with him and to serve him with the rest of my life. And here's the reason. I love him. I love him. This is what this servant was declaring. Fourthly, the servant plainly declared his acknowledgement of a debt of gratitude to the master. Again, look at the words in verse 5. I love my master, my wife, and my children. Now in this situation, he came in by himself. He had married a wife during his time of servitude. A wife was given to him of his master. And this husband and wife now had children together during those 6 years. And the servant recognizes his wife and his children as a blessing. And he says, all these blessings that I'm enjoying are from my master's hand. And I owe everything to him. There is a great need today for God's people to acknowledge we are blessed of God. Amen. God has opened His hand and blessed us abundantly. Amen. What we read in Psalm 115:15, ye are blessed of the Lord which made heaven and earth. That's true today. Of each one of us. You put your own name in place of ye are blessed of the Lord. There's a great need for God's people to very plainly say, without any hesitation, so there be no misunderstanding, so there be no confusion, no uncertainty. This is my master. And all that I have is because of him. And I owe everything to him. He has so wonderfully blessed me. And I voluntarily choose to remain with Him and serve Him the rest of my life. I'm grateful to Him. And for the rest of my life, I want to give honor and glory to Him. That needs to be a public declaration of God's people. The servant also, fifthly, plainly declared his love for others. Again, look at the words in verse 5. I love my master, that's one person. My wife, that's two. My children, that's others. This servant's main motive for remaining with his master was the master, and was his love for the master. That should be our main reason. Amen. We want to serve the Lord because of who He is, because we love Him. But there are some other reasons that we must remain. Amen. And he states them here, my wife and my children. Again, this individual, he had come in, he became a servant by himself. During that servitude, his master gave him a wife and they have children. And he loves his wife, he loves his children. So he can't leave because he has to leave them behind. And he says, here are some other reasons I will not leave. My wife and my children. The servant is saying, for the sake of my wife and my children, I cannot leave my master. I can't leave. Because that would not be good for my wife. Amen. You stop serving God, that's not good for your spouse. Right. It's not good for your children. Many lives have been ruined. Amen. The best husband and the best father and the best wife and mother you can be is to love the Lord and serve the Lord out of love for Him. Amen. For the rest of your life. I've had people tell me, I'm going to stop coming to church because I want to be a better father to my children. Are you serious? Do you hear what you're saying? That's foolishness. Right. This man says, I can't leave because I love my master, but I love my wife, and I love my children. Amen. There's a great need for God's people to realize that our life and our relationship with the Lord, whether you believe it or not, has an effect and an impact upon others. Amen. It affects others. It doesn't just affect you. That's right. It always affects someone else. And it'll affect your spouse and it'll affect your children. Amen. You want to be a blessing to your family, you stand up and openly declare, for the rest of my life, I'm going to serve God. Amen. That's what I'm going to do. Sixthly, the servant plainly declared his attachment to his master. In verse 6, and he shall serve him forever. When his master drove that nail through the lobe of his ear, it went into the doorpost. For a moment, that servant was literally pinned to that doorpost. He was literally attached to that doorpost. And it signaled the bond, the attachment between him and his master. This servant knew his master. And he knew him well. And he was acquainted with his person. He was acquainted with his ways. And he's now come publicly and said very plainly to the judges, "This is my master. I know him. I know his ways. And I'm willing to invest. I am willing to spend and risk the rest of my life for him." The servant is saying, I don't know what's going to happen in my life. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Whatever it is, it's going to happen with me serving my master. That needs to be our attitude as well. That needs to be our declaration. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen a year from now. But whatever it is, I want it to be with my master. I don't want it to be apart from my master. I want it to be with him. He's declaring his attachment. And it's time. It's time for God's people to openly declare, my life is attached to the Lord. As the redeemed of God, our lives ought to be a plain declaration to all. I am attached to my Redeemer. I am attached to the one who saved my soul. There's going to be joys. I guarantee you, if you live long enough, there will be some joys in your life. There's going to be some heartaches. There's going to be some sorrows. There's going to be convenient times. There's going to be inconvenient times. There are going to be easy times and there are going to be difficult and troublesome times. There are going to be some smooth times and there are going to be some rough times. There are going to be some highs, there are going to be some lows, there are going to be some bright days and some fruitful days, and there are going to be some dark days and there are going to be some stormy days. There are going to be days of calm. There are going to be days of turmoil. There are going to be days of peace and there are going to be days of conflict. There are going to be days of friends. There are going to be days of enemies. And there are going to be peaks and there are going to be valleys. But through it all, we ought to plainly say, whatever the circumstance, whatever the day, I am knit, I am bound, I am intertwined with the Lord. He is my life. Let there be no confusion. Let there be no uncertainty. God is my life. It's time for all God's people to make that an open declaration. Seventhly, lastly, the servant plainly declared his commitment to his master. Again, as that servant walks with his master to the judges, and when that servant placed his ear to the doorpost, that nail was driven through his earlobe. At that moment, he was setting his life apart for the master. He is setting his entire life apart for the master. He's making a commitment. We live in a day where commitment means nothing. But that should not be when it comes to the Lord. We need to be committed to the Lord. Committed to the Lord's cause. He was making a commitment to the Lord. He was pledging the rest of his life Again, he doesn't know how long that will be. He doesn't know what it'll entail, and neither do you and I. But he was pledging the rest of his life to his master. So when that servant came with his master and stood before the judges, he was saying, listen up, everybody. I want to be plain about this. I have freedom today to return to my old life. I have freedom today to return to my former life. But I choose this man whom I love. I choose his house. I choose his rules. Quit trying to make your own rules. Amen. I choose his rules. I choose his ways. And I choose today to be identified and associated with this man. Let the judges be my witness. And he'd put his ear up to the doorpost and he would say, pierce my ear to the doorpost. Here is a man planning on serving his master. And oh, how that needs to be so. This is his life plan. It was just as Joshua said in Joshua 24:15. As for me and my house, regardless of whatever everybody else is doing, as for me and my house, we will. He was making it his life plan. You think about it. 6 years passes. Perhaps there were other servants who came in on the same day that this servant came in. Their 6 years were up as well. And perhaps some of them said, I'm going back home. I'm going back to my old life. But this man, he said it doesn't matter what others are doing. This is my life plan. I'm going to stay with my master. I'm going to serve my master. Is it not time? Again, we've already stated it. We live in the last days of the last days. That's not to be a sad time. It's a great privilege to live in such days. I mean, all the people that's ever lived, God planned it that you and I would live in these last days. Did He leave us here to just do what we please and what gives us pleasure? Or did He at least save us and leave us here to serve Him? Needs to be. It's time. It's time for God's people to quit bouncing back and forth. Quit letting their lives be dictated by circumstances and by feelings. And just boldly declare, this is my master. He saved my soul. And He's blessed me every day since. I'm going to serve Him. Regardless of what my husband does, regardless of what my wife does, regardless of what my children do, my grandchildren, regardless of what other church members do, I'm going to serve the Lord. I'm going to serve Him. It's time. So I ask you today, when that servant put his ear to the doorpost, he was saying, I'm willing to be branded for my master. Are we willing to be branded for the Lord? Amen. Does our life, look at our lives. Each one, look at your life. Does our life plainly declare, without any confusion, without any uncertainty, I love my master. Our lives ought to very plainly declare that. I love my master. Because I do, I'm going to serve him for however many days I have remaining. I'm going to serve him. Our lives ought to plainly say, Jesus Christ is real to me. Amen. He's not just a doctrine. He's real. Amen. Our lives ought to declare that. Your lives declare something about Christ, how you feel about Christ. Our lives ought to declare, He's my friend. People all concerned today, well, I don't want to offend my friends. Your life ought to declare that Jesus Christ is your friend. Amen. And if it doesn't, there's something wrong with your life. He's my friend. And we're His friend. Amen. Our lives ought to declare, I belong to Him. I don't belong to a company. I don't belong to a family. I belong to Him. Amen. And I'm grateful. Our lives ought to declare, I'm grateful for what He's done in my life. Amen. And our lives ought to declare that He's not just a part of my life. Mm-hmm. He is my life. Amen. It's time for God's people to quit trying to fit God into their lives and just say, He is my life. Mm-hmm. So many are just trying to fit God in somewhere. God's to be your life. Amen. When you try to fit Him in, then you make everything else takes priority. But you make Him your life. He is our life. Our lives should not send a mixed message. And it shouldn't concern us. Well, I don't want to displease so-and-so. They've been good to me. You need to get over that. Because our lives should not send a mixed message with regard to the Lord. He's my friend. He's my best friend. And if you're going to, our lives ought to declare, if you're going to force me to choose between your friendship and His, there's no decision to be made. It's Him. He's my life. He's my life. Can we say, with this servant, I prefer the one who saved my soul above everyone else, above all else. I prefer Him. Can we say with this servant, I refuse all other masters. I refuse all other masters. A lot of people who make professions of faith, I don't know if they're saved or not. That's between them and the Lord. But there is one thing that's very plain. They've chosen other masters. And their lives are dictated by other masters. Well, Pastor, I won't be there Sunday. I've got to work. You've chosen another master. Yeah. Well, I got to feed my family. You've chosen another master. Yeah. How many of us will say, I refuse all other masters and I refuse to go my own way? My way is not God's way, many times. I refuse to go my own way. I refuse to go back to my old life. I don't want to go back there. Can we say with this servant, I've chosen to remain with Him. I've chosen to remain with Him. I've chosen to be identified with Him. And I desire to be branded for Him, and I want everyone to know who I'm living for. There may be some children of God, there are many. They've wasted years of their life living for the temporal, living for self. Oh, and they always have a good reason in their mind. They always have a reason. And they'll come up, if you do away with that reason, they'll come up with another one. I've seen it many times. I'm not at church and I don't serve the Lord because my husband. The Lord takes their husband and they're still doing the same thing. Nothing's changed because the husband wasn't the problem. Or I came because of my children. People don't run out of reasons or excuses. But you take away the excuse, they'll find another one. Because the problem is they don't love the master. Can we openly, without any hesitation or reluctance, I'm going to serve the Lord with the rest of my life? It would be wonderful as we start this chapter of our lives. However, I may pass away tonight. I don't know. You may too. But it'd be wonderful if God's people individually would openly declare, I'm going to live for the Lord. I can't do it on my own. I can't do it in my own strength. And every day I'm going to pray, Lord, give me the strength I need. Amen. But it is my intent. I'm going to live for Him. Lord, help me. Do you want to live for Him today? Let's say your 6 years are up. Today's the day. You have to make a declaration. There's no in between. You can't do both. You have to do one or the other. What's it going to be? Will you declare in the hearing of everyone, I want to serve the Lord. Whatever happens, doesn't matter. The Lord's been good to me, and I'm going to serve Him regardless. It's time. It's time for God's people to make that declaration. As the song leader comes, we'll have a song of invitation. Again, I would put the challenge